Suman, he's from India, and we're payroll hero. Very good. And he eats bananas.
Okay, that wasn't
That's my
necessary.
intro.
I just need a quick forward on how many guys have actually encountered Backbone before?
What?
How many people have?
Anyone without a backbone.
This talk is mostly targeted towards Backbone.
Open.
So, how many people have worked on Backbone before?
Don't be shy.
Let's need a count.
Those guys.
Three, four.
Logical.
Just to do the intro.
So, I think that JavaScript and Ruby, they kind of go hand in hand because both of them are functional programming languages and they are very powerful, and for building a web app, you kind of need both of them. So, Backbone is basically a MVC framework for client-side coding. By MVC, it means models, collections, and views. So the C doesn't stand for controller like Ruby. It stands for collections. Previously, the older versions of Backbone used to have controllers, but that got dropped in 09.2. So it became collections. So just give a brief intro about what model, collection, views, and all these things are. So model on the client side is something that more or less represents an entity on the server side. In our case, like it might be a database object or a collection of few of them representing a hash or something. So that is basically what a model is. A collection is a bunch of models together. You can say that it's an array. One more component in there is views, which is most of the view components that you see, like a form or a list of items, a row in a table. So that's what a view represents. So these are the three main modules in Backbone. If you open up the code base of Backbone, these are the three main modules. Other than that, there's router, which if you type in the URLs hash something, so that basically maps to a route and it will perform some action based on that. And another pretty important module is Backbone Sync, which is used to perform AJAX calls and get back data from the server and display it. So that is basically just for AJAX calls. And one more thing is events, which is kind of very important. There is one more module, and events basically are bound together with the models. So like on change of the model, you fire some event, or like if you destroy the model, you trigger some event, something like that. So if you start using Backbone, what are the hard dependencies? It's underscore. So you got to have that, otherwise you cannot use Backbone. Both of these are products from Document Cloud, or what's the name? Yeah, it's a company called Document Cloud. So both Backbone and underscore, they're both made by the same guys. And soft dependencies is something that responds to dollar, like jQuery or Zepto. So either of them will work with Backbone. Other than that, another dependency, it's not kind of a dependency, but it's a good to have thing. Something like a client-side templating engine. So you can either use Mustache or I can add jQuery or Handlebar. These are all templating engines. What we deal with in this code base is jQuery as the library for JavaScript stuff, and for the templating we are using IconHas and of course underscore. So I'll start with like how we kind of came up with the idea of using Backbone. Briefly show you how the product works. So this is mainly what the requirement was, like a one-page some interactions on a page. So this thing is kind of the list. If you select that, then the form gets updated with data dynamically, and you can kind of like update it. Just update, gets updated, and the data changes instantly. You can press add a new, and it will fill it up with data for a new item. And something you can create it. So it gets added to the list. You can change it, you can delete stuff if you want. Let's delete it. So this was the main requirement, and let's try to figure out on this page what are the main components that we are dealing with. So one of them, as you can see, is a list, and each list contains a bunch of items, like this form or and that one. So these items that are displayed on the list act as models, and whatever is contained within the list is basically a representation of the collection. And the rest of them, like the data displayed in the list, is a view component, or the form is a view component. So these are the three main stuff that we are dealing with here. The model is basically whatever data is represented within this row, and the collection is this list, this whole list, and the view components like the form and the representation of the model. And there are a bunch of other small interactions in the page, like the moment you update this form based on the date, this thing gets updated, the choice of the month, and displays flash messages and stuff. So let's look at how we started working on this product. The whole thing. Briefly, this is kind of namespace for the whole code base. We pass like the main namespace is payroll, and we want to deal with local objects, so that's why we pass jQuery and Backbone, and ICA stands for I can has. So we pass them and deal with them locally so that they do not keep referencing outside the namespace all the time. The lookup is kind of faster if you do that. So the model that we represented is item. In this case, it is just an instance of Backbone model. The model is Backbone is the main namespace, and model is one of the modules included, like one of the classes. If we scroll down a little bit, we see that there is something called item collection rate. That just extends the core class of Backbone called collection. It's just inheriting it, and we need to pass an option called model so that it knows which, like the collection needs to be bound to a model, what kind of model it's needed. And we kind of need an instance of that collection so that it can push data onto that instance, basically the collection, and it can pull stuff out of it, update it. So this is kind of that instance items. And so as you can see, all of them are like are kind of private stuff, right? Because they are not exposed outside the namespace. So you cannot have access to either item collection or item or items, either of them outside this particular namespace. In fact, outside this anonymous function that acts as a closure. So in Ruby, if you kind of try to relate closures in Ruby and JavaScript. In JavaScript, anonymous functions are closures. In Ruby, lambdas are closures, basically. So, and one more thing that's kind of important is this acts as a self-invoking function, right? Because as you can see, the namespace was created and then it was called immediately after that. So how that thing helps is so that you cannot instantiate it again and again. So nobody can do that by mistake, right? It gets instantiated whenever you load the JavaScript and that's it, it's done. So, that's kind of a security measure. So, alright. Don't worry about the comments.
That's very nice. That's for documentation?
Yes, it's JS stuff. It
Oh,
follows
great.
JS stuff format.
Turn on.
So
Is that similar to the way CoffeeScript generates? I know it does some of the same stuff.
yes, it is also built on top of JS stuff.
Okay.
If people are like thinking about documentation, I guess one of the best documenting procedures for JavaScript is the Google's closure compiler.
Mm.
It's awesome, and it's also built on top of JS stuff. So either of these syntaxes will work. We'll quickly look at go back to item once and talk a little bit more. So model needs to have a unique ID so that it can be identified, and it responds to methods like isNew. So basically, whenever it's a new instance, then it has got some random ID assigned to it, just like Rails does it. In the case of like nested stuff, you can find that Rails assigns a random ID to it. In case of nested modes, Backbone pretty much follows the same procedure. Just assigns a random ID, maybe based on the timestamp or something. So in here, what you can see is call a method called on, which basically adds an event to items, the object items, so that whenever you add something to that collection, it triggers this event and invokes that function. So as you can see here, it creates a new view item and renders it. So where this thing actually is used is when we add something in here, it triggers that, it fires that add event, because the item gets pushed to the collection, to the instance of collection, and it immediately triggers that add event. And it, so when we create one, it triggers the add event, and then there's the view component that gets rendered. So you can add like custom events to it if you want, other than add new, because these are the basic ones which it responds to. But other than that, you can define custom events on that as well. We'll quickly move down to the list representation. So let's have a look at item view. Briefly, like item view is whatever represents this row within the list. That is one component. So it kind of inherits from the main class Backbone view. So yeah, this is kind of something interesting. Backbone follows the way it inherits stuff is using objects. So basically, in JavaScript you can have different ways of inheriting, and class-based architectures, like they can follow different patterns. And one of them is like just to extend an object, keep adding more properties to the object. That's what Backbone follows. Like they are kind of moving away from the classical inheritance approach, wherein we kind of open a class and then use the prototype and keep adding stuff to it. Like in this example, you will find that I have used prototype in some cases. like if you go down,
Slash prototype.
like in this one, yeah, it's a, there are a couple of them, so I'll be jumping around. So in this case, like I've just extended the prototype of this class called item page. There is a classical inheritance approach in JavaScript, but I guess more people are moving towards the approach of extending objects instead of using the prototype again and again. So this way, like Backbone is pretty good at that.
Does that extend it adds behavior to the constructor? Is that what's going on there?
Yes, it basically just adds more behavior to the constructor.
Okay.
So, one quick note, like in this case, item form is basically acting as a class. Oh, we were talking about views. So, yes, item views, as you can see, it's also wrapped around in a self-invoking function, so that we do not create these classes again and again. This is kind of another approach. And as you can see, most of these functions are like they're starting with an underscore because they kind of represent a private method within these classes.
That's a convention.
Sorry?
It's a convention.
Yes. And we can keep referring to them from within this extension of Backbone view. One more thing is I keep using this within that within these private methods is because when I invoke these private methods, I always use apply and pass the reference of this to the private method. So although they kind of look like instance methods, they are not instance methods. Because until and unless you pass the reference of this, it will not understand what it refers to. So in Backbone view, you need to pass something like an ID or a class name or a container through which it can identify the element in the view. So in this case, we just need the class name, and I kind of dynamically generate the item. So because the ID of the item is kind of dynamic. It depends on the ID of the model that's passed in. So that's why I keep using something called set element. You can see this is a method within Backbone view, and we can use this method to dynamically set the element the view is referring to. It does not need to be set when it instantiates it, but it can be set like any other point of time, like even when you are trying to render it. We can change the element that the view is referring to. And that is helpful in cases when you cannot determine the ID of the object, like when you are instantiating the object. Maybe you need to pass around some variable to it. So this is kind of helpful. And so we'll briefly talk about a couple of these properties that Backbone view responds to. One of them is events. So in the view, you can bind some components within the view to certain kind of callbacks. So in this case, I bind click to a function called update form, but I can also say like XYZ, like hash XYZ, which represents an ID of something within the view component, and colon click and bind it to some other function. So, but something that we should keep in mind is all the events that are found here, they all refer to elements within the view component. So you should not be binding stuff that refers to some component outside the view element, because then the reference pointer this it changes. then you need to pass a reference of this. So it's kind of very bad practice as well. So one more callback that it responds to is initialize. Is like a callback that gets triggered after you instantiate a view object. So you can. So this is where I basically set the element within that method. I do not set it when I instantiate it, but this is the callback that the instance triggers when it gets called as new, and this is the callback that actually sets up. So you guys can use this. One more thing that's pretty important is bound changes in the model to make the view respond to stuff. Like when you change the model, so basically the view, every view has got a property called model. Every view should be bound to a model. As you can see here, this whole thing, this whole block is a view element which is bound to the model representing the data. So, so whenever you access model, you can like bind some events to it. Like in this case, the change event on the model is bound to the view. So whenever the model changes, the view will get updated automatically. So basically, that's what happens in case you update this. Slow, but it kind of got updated here. So that's what happens. The change event gets triggered because when the model got changed, the view gets changed as well. And so when you instantiate a view, it just creates an element on the page wrapped with jQuery object or wrapped with Zepto, but it does not append anything. It is just a floating object, but it needs to be rendered, right? So that's why it responds to one of these callbacks called render. This kind of used to actually display the stuff on the page. And yes, that's pretty much on the rows. So we can go back to the form and see a couple of stuff. Okay, so in the form, so one of the properties that you can pass to identify the elements is a tag name. In general, like div is the default, but you can pass some other element as well, like li or ul or form. So whenever it searches, the idea of this is that like lookups in JavaScript are one of the, basically lookups in the DOM is one of the costliest affairs in client-side coding. So we kind of need to limit the scope of the lookup. So that's why you need to pass more references to that view element you are looking for. That's why it's always good if you pass tag name, ID, class name, if it's available.
Or you're using find within the scope of this element.
Sorry?
You're using find within the scope of the element, which limits the.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's true for all the view components. So they all search for. That's why I was saying like whenever you are binding events, like bind to events, bind to components that are within that view object. So that's why it always searches within the scope. So in this one, it's pretty much the same, like response to render and initialize as a callback. A couple of stuff found, like when you create or update something on the form, basically submit it, then it triggers this callback and does some stuff. So one pretty important thing is Backbone, when it sends data to the server, it does not create a namespace around the parameters. Like Rails by default responds to something like, if you have a model called XYZ, whenever you submit a form in Rails, it will have like XYZ mapping to another hash, and within that hash it will have the properties of the object. Right? Backbone doesn't do it. It does not generate a wrapper around the attributes of the object. It just appends everything to the main scope and sends it. Like so, if you have a model with properties like ID and name, then it won't be. So basically, what it would be sending is something like this. But Rails kind of prefers something like this.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
So it's easier to deal with things when you have one more scope around it, right? Because you can always refer to that. But Backbone doesn't do this, so it's kind of problematic. So one way of dealing with that is you change the way Rails handles stuff. Basically, you have to change the configuration. There's a particular setting in config that you can update to tell Rails that, oh, I'm not going to look into the scope anymore. I will collect stuff from the main params hash. Whereas, or else you can like update the way Backbone handles it. And this is one of the like workarounds wherein you can. So Backbone sync is the stuff that sends data to the server and handles the callbacks from the AJAX. So these options are passed in to Backbone sync, and it acts as your normal AJAX calls. Like you can have more control over your AJAX calls if you pass in these options like that. Like whenever you are invoking items create or items update or save, you can just pass in these options, like customizable options. So that is one workaround that I kind of encountered. Other than that, so one more class that I've used is page handler, because the add button basically does not belong to this components. It is something not related to the list. It's not related to the form either, because the update or the delete and everything needs to be bound to an existing object. So it needs to have an ID that it understands. Whereas the add button can basically be agnostic of the IDs and stuff, right? It is always going to create a new item. It's always going to fill the form with a new item. So that's why stuff that are not bound to a specific collection or a specific view item, they reside in another class called item handler. And as you can see, it just binds the click event to the function called add new. One more thing that we can do with events is, in general, it accepts a JavaScript object like a hash, but you can also use a function because it responds to both of them. So all these classes that we talked about before are all private, and they are private within the scope of the namespace. The only publicly accessible class is this one called item page. So this is kind of a property of the main namespace purely. And this is the only stuff that's accessible publicly. So this kind of throws in all together, and you can pass in options to it, some callbacks to it, and you build the objects, and it'll create the instances of the views, it will create the instances of the models. So nobody needs to know what is going on in the background.
Yeah, sorry, more chairs.
Two more here.
Trying to briefly talk about. So this thing is more like an API that has been exposed, because this like any form that has any page that has got one form and a list will be can basically use this for this whole class and database. So one of the classes that kind of uses this is so this is one of the classes that which uses this interface. So as you can see, what it does is it accepts a bunch of parameters where it needs the ID of the first element that it's going to select when you refresh the page. So that can be configured, and then it extends the prototype of that class to. So that interface actually handles a couple of callbacks that you can pass, like before and after you render the form, or before and after you render the list item, it can respond to stuff. So those are like configurable callbacks that you can pass to it. And so as an example, let's say, like whenever you select an element here, it kind of updates the month that it is pointing to. So that thing can be passed in as a configurable callback, and it can respond to that. Like the interface, it responds to that. So one more thing that we need for the backbone models is something called URL routes, because it needs to understand where to send the request to in the server. So this is a configurable option in this case, because that kind of is not related to one specific model on the server. And the models also respond to validates, like it can respond to validations that you set up for update or create. So this callback will be called every time you try to update the item. So as an example, this is kind of a form for displaying holiday calendars only for 1 year. But if you select a date from 2010 or something, it should show an error. So that's the validation that's working. And so this is kind of something that even I don't know whether it's a very good practice or not, but in all these functions, this pointer basically refers to the model. So like any suggestion on this is really welcome, because it has been called from outside this namespace, right? So, and this callback will be executed within the scope of that namespace. So that's why whenever we are passing validates or anything, like callback functions from outside the scope of the namespace, we need to be very careful what this pointer refers to, because people can get very confused in that.
Have you experimented with CoffeeScript?
This CoffeeScript is just syntactic sugar around JavaScript, right?
It has specific meaning, like it takes care of some of the things about like what this means in various contexts. It helps you with some of that stuff. It also has some opinions about the class, class structure stuff. I myself am not totally clear on, actually CoffeeScript is helping learn a little more about JavaScript.
It's kind of ruining the whole thing, right?
But yeah, the whole business of apply, I don't really have to do apply anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's but
and like I
I
said,
don't know if it's bad practice or not.
I know this thing is kind of messy because this particular class, it deals with like options that are executed in different contexts.
Sure. So
Right.
you're saying the validate model is in different contexts. This means something different, and you're just sort of like kind of duck typing it, like
Yes.
okay.
So it's kind of a hackish solution, right? But
Okay,
any
we're Ruby
suggestions on
developers.
this?
It's all good.
Yes, we kind of like have some configurable options here, like some callbacks that you can respond to, like after render form or after render list item. These are kind of not part of Backbone. So they just get called after you render the forms or after you render the list item. These are like configurable options.
So you create your
This
own
can still work as an API. This one,
After render form, is that something that's part of Backbone?
no,
No, it's your
not.
own, right?
No, that's your own
Yes,
thing.
there are like some callbacks that you can respond to.
Oh, okay.
So like I use it for dealing with these things,
Okay.
the pointing of the marks,
Okay.
or like updating the header and stuff, because they are not really closely bound to the models or anything, right? They are very specific to that particular interaction in the page.
Mm.
So yes. The representation of the model on the server is something like this. We kind of use a pattern called presenters, which is just a layer on top of models and like lies in between the model and the view.
Uh-huh.
So this is the hash that is actually represented as model. So
Right.
as you can see, like it has got ID, name, and date, and some name. So yes, that's why I was saying like the model does not need to represent a row of a table on the database.
Oh.
It can be a collection of a bunch of stuff.
How many models are involved in that form?
Only one.
One. It's a
No,
complex.
actually,
It's a complex form. A lot of behavior.
and a brief introduction to the templating engine that I'm using. Like, so what happens is whenever the model gets all the data, and we'll just go back to.
Icon has is mustache. Or
Yes, it's built on top of Mr.
Oh, okay.
So, briefly, in the render, sorry. So, yes, this template basically is pointing to an ID of the mustache template. So this template ID is something like this. So that is what it points to. And then that renders a partial like this, which accepts a bunch of options as a JavaScript object. Like you need to have these things as the keys. Like month and day will be the key, and weekday will be the key, and then you can pass a value and render this partial using icon has. So that is something called JavaScript templating. Like other than icon has, we can also use other kind of templates. You can use mustache or handlebar is one of them, which is pretty new and pretty powerful too. So yes, I guess I've pretty much shown all the stuff here. And one thing that we should keep in mind is Backbone only responds to JSON responses, so don't throw back HTML at it. It's going to go crazy. And it's also kind of a best practice if you're kind of with one-page apps to respond back with JSON.
Are you using the router or the history stuff at all?
No, not yet. Because in this interface, we have not yet felt the need. But right now, like we have a couple of new features coming up. Where if you select one of these months, then it should update stuff. So in that case, the router would come in handy because it's a link, and you would need the hashtags here.
Yeah, we didn't start using it either.
Yeah, so
like
far we
later in the
haven't
project.
had the need.
Right.
But, I guess we'll be having it pretty soon.
I mean, I keep hearing that Backbone is good for like the back button, the
Sorry?
behavior. Backbone, I hear, is pretty good with the back button behavior. Do you know anything about that? Or
Well,
how-
that's what.
is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, a little bit.
Is that the
Because
the hash?
what he's saying is if you clicked on the months, then it would add like a tag up there with the month.
Yes.
And that would imply like a little
would
a
point
route within the
route.
page.
So when you hit back, you would go back to the
You would
previous
go back to
Yes.
the previous month.
I see.
That's it. Yes. Thank you. Any questions?
Only a suggestion. Coffee.
Yep. I vote for AS 3.1. That would happen soon.
Are you using Jasmine also with this?
Yes, so all this is kind of tested in Jasmine.
Yeah.
There's only one problem with.
Show some Jasmine.
Yeah, sure. So, in the Jasmine test, I can only test the publicly available interface of it, right? Because other stuff are not accessible. So, all I test is this class called item page. That's why I kind of have a subject like we have in Outspec. It's just a function that creates a new subject every time. And here are a bunch of stuff. So one pretty important thing about using icon has is because Jasmine doesn't do a page reload, it keeps running all the tests within the same page, right? So the template needs to get updated all the time because otherwise it does not understand if the template was there from a previous test, it kind of gets confused and always keeps calling back the previous one. That's why we need to do icon has refresh so that it refreshes the template. That's kind of another happy thing. Yeah.
Cool.
There's something that I encountered while writing the Jasmine test is I always wanted that the font be a singleton object because there should be only one object of the form in the whole page, right? But I could not do that because if I'm trying to use Jasmine to run bunch of describes, then it will keep creating new instances of form. And so I cannot use the. In that case, I'll have to go back and keep deleting the objects manually. That's a good thing to do. That's why to restrict that thing, I ended up doing something here. So in this one, whenever it instantiates an instance of item page, the class that uses this, the utility, this interface. This interface is used by another class called calendar item, which is a representation of the model on the calendar page. Right. So whenever it instantiates it, I kind of have a global object, not in fact a global object, but an object that is available within the namespace in which this class was created. And it acts as a cache. So like every time you try to instantiate one, if there is already an existing item instance of item page, then it will keep rendering back that one instead of like creating a new one every time.
Did you do any kind of fixtures with your test in
Jasmine?
In Jasmine?
Yes.
Just curious if there's some tricks.
I don't even remember the name of it.
The JavaScript.
Sorry, where am I searching? As you can see, like this fixture is it's not really bound to any specific model or anything. It's independent of what kind of HTML exists on the actual page here. It's just a minimalistic fixture. So I've used like really minimal amount of icon hash templates. Thanks.